Welcome to East Coast Winemaking, the podcast that brings professional winemaking experience from popular wine regions on the East Coast of the United States to wherever you are. I'm your host, John Monier. I'm a Finger Lakes winemaker, and I'm excited to provide easy access to educational and entertaining interviews with other winemakers and industry professionals. In each episode, we'll cover the background and unique perspective of my guest on how they approach the craft of winemaking. I'm excited for the opportunity to learn from seasoned wine pros and hope these interviews can be informative to both colleagues in the industry as well as relative newcomers. Feel free to email questions or comments to eastcoastwinemaking@gmail.com and follow us at East Coast Winemaking on Instagram to be notified when new episodes come out. If you're interested in checking out my wine called John Albert, you can find info on that at johnalbertwine.com. Happy podcast day, everyone. Today I'm bringing you an interview with a fellow East Coast winemaker. His name is Darrin Scott. Darrin and I first met when he was my boss when I got my first cellar gig, and subsequently he's held a number of head winemaker positions, slowly moving south down the East Coast from Pennsylvania and now to Mullica Hill, New Jersey. He's working at a winery called William Heritage that are making some really tasty, unique wines. He and I spoke for quite a while about a range of topics, from some niche winemaking stuff to his experience with the spotted lanternfly. I had a great time talking with him, and I hope that there's some meat on the bone for y'all listening at home. So I hope y'all enjoy the conversation that I had with my friend Darrin. Darrin Scott, good afternoon. How are you?
How's it going?
I have to say, I am thrilled that I am finally able to meet with somebody that I'm not in the same room with. This is kind of a big step for the production of my podcast, to be able to chat with somebody over Zoom. And you're my first non-New York interview, and I'm just excited that all these things are happening. So thank you for letting me experiment with you and send you a microphone to your home and meet with me over Zoom. And hopefully we don't have to do this twice because, well, I don't even think I would ask you to do it twice if the audio all got erased or something, because I don't know what I'm doing with Zoom or something like that. So, thanks for potentially donating an hour and a half of your life to me unnecessarily.
No problem. Anytime.
So you and I have a previous professional relationship. We worked together at Ravines for a number of years, but before we get to any of the current stuff, I'm hoping that you'll tell me the story of where your interest in wine production began and kind of all the major steps that led you to where you are now. This is a good time to mention, is your title head winemaker where you are now?
Yep. But yeah, it's just winemaker, but there's no one above me.
Sure. And you're at William Heritage?
Yeah, William Heritage Winery in New Jersey, Mullica Hills.
Okay,
Mullica Hills.
So from when you were a little boy who decided to get into winemaking through to how you got to where you are now, if you could hit us with all the spots in your journey, school, internships, life experiences, that sort of thing, and I'll just let you take it away.
Yeah, so my journey kind of began with my father. He was in the tech industry, and early 2000s, the tech industry in the States went overseas. He took a severance check and planted a vineyard when I was in high school. And so I started in his vineyard. Yeah, it's a big shift.
Interesting that he would make that decision, but really cool.
Yeah. And so my journey kind of begins in high school. I worked in his vineyard, and then he had a very good friend that kind of helped mentor him, Kevin Bubblemoyer. Kevin had planted a vineyard probably 4 or 5 years before my father planted his vineyard. So he had a little stick in the game. And I went and worked with Kevin for quite a while. That was kind of like my summer job in college. For college, I went to Penn State. The intention was to get into winemaking. It shows how little I knew at the time. So I grew up in Lehigh Valley, PA. Most of the wineries in the area were second career individuals that started wineries, and a lot of them had chemical engineering backgrounds. So I declared my major at Penn State as a chemical engineer.
Interesting.
Got 2 years into that program and decided that was not the right path that I wanted to take.
It sounds like a really hard track to then. I mean, like I can see the connection, but just the thought of completing a degree in chemical engineering sounds like a daunting task.
Yeah, but it was amazing how many wineries and winemakers in our area were all started by people that came out of air products and these chemical engineering fields. And I was like, well, that's the route I got to go. I kind of knew of enology programs, but there weren't really many programs on the East Coast. Virginia Tech had just dropped their program when I went into school. The only other school that I really knew about on the East Coast was Cornell, and then there's a school up in Canada, Brock University, which I wasn't moving to Canada to go to school. So I stayed in state, went to Penn State. Penn State had just started their like extension, winery extension. The vineyard extension had always been around for a bit. But the winery extension was kind of growing. And that was right around the time Denise Gardner had started up at Penn State. And so, yeah, I just declared to Penn State. I said I was going to go chemical engineering, got to that point and was like, I need to switch. So I switched into the food science program, which is where Denise Gardner's research was being done out of. And the food science program was absolutely perfect for getting into this industry. I mean, it gave you a full background of not only chemistry, food chemistry, but also food microbiology. It also put into my mind sanitation, particularly like pertaining to the dairy industry and like how much more intense they are when it comes to sanitation as opposed to the wine industry. But it's like it's a really good background to fall back on, be like, well, they do these kinds of things here, and I can apply some of this information to what I'm doing in the winery. And then beyond that, I just wanted to work. So while I was at Penn State, I did like a pre-harvest, I almost call it. I actually worked with the entomology professor. He had a small winery, Nittany Mountain Vineyards, I believe it was. So I would like go over and like help him harvest grapes during the fall semester.
And he was an entomology professor?
Yeah. So bugs.
Interesting.
Bugs and lanternflies. No, lanternflies weren't around at that point.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about those later.
Yeah. So that was kind of like my first jump into the winery. And it was just a really small thing. I just volunteered my free time, on the weekends to help him pick grapes. And, I would go over and help him start yeast cultures and do some punch downs and just little things. Time wise, I wasn't really there that long. It wasn't like a full commitment because I was still taking all my classes. And then I did my first harvest in 2012 at Blair Vineyards, which is now Cedar Ridge Vineyards. That was my first full harvest. I had taken like a small break from school and did that harvest in the fall semester season. Then I finished up my studies spring semester. And then after that harvest and after finishing school, there was a guy that came around our area and he bought a vineyard that I had worked with at Pinnacle Ridge. Pinnacle Ridge was also another like big influence for me. That was kind of my summer job. I mostly started working in the tasting room, but I would help out in the winery when I could, just being the bottling guy or labeling up bottles or whatever. It's a very nice winery, pretty small, but they had started with Pinnacle under Brad Knapp, who was a chemical engineer, and then Bill Luck and Bill, who was also a chemical engineer. They both worked together at Bell Labs, or they both worked together in the chemical engineering field, and then they both quit kind of midlife crisis. Bill started the vineyard, and Brad started the winery. So I worked in the winery with Brad quite a bit, and learned a lot through him and learned a lot through just being a tasting room employee. Got to taste a lot of wine at that point, and I really started developing my palate and started getting hints from people that like your palate's on point and you're only well I was 21 21 and I could describe wines better than people that were you know midway through their life. So it just kind of like naturally clicked for me. It was kind of an easy spot, and I got to taste through a lot of different vintages at that point. So my vintage palette kind of starts around like 2005 or so in the PA area.
How much of that do you think was a learned skill versus something that came naturally to you?
I think it came pretty naturally. I mean, at that point I had always had a good interest in wine, but like I wasn't really drinking a whole lot because I was underage. My parents were they allowed me to try wine with dinner. And I think that kind of like spurred things on a little bit. And then once I hit the tasting room, it was kind of hitting the ground running. We had to taste every bottle that we opened. Back then, everything was under cork. So, and that was kind of around the time when there was a lot of cork bottles coming out. The cork industry had kind of gone through a bit of a fluctuation at that point. So we had to taste everything. So it was a period in my life where I was getting to try a lot of wine in a controlled setting and really had to think about what I was tasting. So that was great. That really spurred things on. I think it kind of mostly just came naturally for me. I mean, I don't think I was really like thinking about, oh, I need to learn this at this point. It was more of I enjoy doing this kind of work and I enjoy being in this industry. And um, it was more about being able to talk about the wines with the customers rather than evaluating them for myself. So
Sure.
it was a very baseline type of tasting for me.
Sure. Well, it sounds like you also must have benefited from it being something that you were genuinely interested in, which, the difference between learning something that you're interested in and learning something that you have to because you're in school or whatever, and you have to take a test. It's in my experience, it's a lot easier typically to pick something up when it's your genuine interest.
Yeah, and the other thing for me too is, prior to getting into that tasting room and being able to taste all those wines, I was in the vineyard, but I wasn't tasting wine that much, occasional glass or occasional tasting at dinner. And that was pretty much it. But then to finally get into a winery and be able to taste some of the products that I was, had a hand in, that was really eye opening for me, and it was a really good experience. And it was, I was there from ground zero, um, out there pruning, out there tucking leaves, out there tucking, out there pulling leaves. It was neat to finally taste the end product, which came, several years after I had been doing some vineyard work.
Sure. We'll talk about another educational opportunity to be able to taste wine from juice to finished wine and into the future. I mean, you can you pick up so much on how the wines change and get to where they are by being able to taste. I think over the lifetime of the wine like that.
Yeah, yeah, and my time at Pinnacle was great because the owner Brad, he saw potential in myself, I believe. So he would invite me over to taste wines when his consultant was coming in, which was super eye opening. I mean, we were doing like, you know, half gram per liter adds to wine for like finishing, polishing off before bottling and stuff like that. And it was like, oh, this stuff really changes quite a bit when you start making small additions to that. And I had not been exposed to that kind of technical winemaking up until this point. So it was really nice to like just be involved. And he just invited me over, sat around his kitchen with with his consultant who would come in once a year, taste through the wines before they were bottled, and just see if anything needed tweaking. Most of the time we didn't end up tweaking anything, but it's a good practice to get in there and just try it. Just see, is that, do you want a little bit more acid in there? It's not always apparent right away, but then once you taste through it, it's like, no, I think we're okay. Or yeah, I think we could use a little bump or a little bump in sugar or something along those lines. Just, final tweakings before you throw the wine in bottle and send it off forever.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. So what came after this experience for you?
So after that, then it was Blair Vineyards, which is now Setter Ridge. That was my first full blown harvest, and that was great. Richard had planted a vineyard. I want to say back in like 2007 or so. Don't quote me on that. And that was just my first full harvest, and Richard also took a liking to me. It's also kind of like a mentor type person. And, he really exposed me to a lot of wines of the world. He was big into French wines, wines which just weren't on my radar. So, it was customary for us he would make lunch for us every day at the winery, and he'd open a bottle of wine, and we would just taste and enjoy lunch. We would sit down, always had like an hour-long lunch at least, which was
Heck yeah.
Yeah, that was really awesome. And then getting back into the cellar and being on the floor, and that was kind of my first experience. Just cleaning pumps, cleaning the press, doing punch downs, everything under the sun. And that was great. And I spent my first week there power washing lugs, FYBs, for a whole week. And looking back on it, it was like I kind of volunteered to do it, and they're like, yeah, have at it. And I think I did too good of a job because they were just like, keep going.
For anybody who's not aware, lugs, or FYBs, which is the acronym for fucking yellow bins, are the trays that people spread in the vineyard and pick the grapes into as a way of getting the grapes hand-picked out of the vineyard. And the reason why they cause everybody to roll their eyes and scoff is because they're spread in like the hundreds. And so to clean them with a hose, much less to pressure wash them one at a time, is a daunting task. You're bent over, you get wet because they spray water back at you, like, trying to rinse a spoon in the sink or something like that. And they have all these nooks and crannies that hold on to dirt, and they get sticky, and it's just a thankless, crappy job, which everybody, it's like you need to go through it if you're going to get into the wine industry. It's your initiation. Right.
Yep. So that was Blair. Blair was great. It was a fantastic experience. Then after that, there was a guy that came around and purchased the Luckinville farm. He was a corn farmer, so not a lot of experience growing grapes, and there weren't a lot of people around the area that had experience growing grapes or any sort of vineyard work. So I went and I was his vineyard manager for a year. That was Stony Run Valley Vineyards, and that was a great experience too. But that was kind of the experience that really pushed me back towards the winery. I thoroughly enjoyed my time being out in the vineyard, developing spray programs and doing all the handwork, but my mind was always kind of chemistry related and microbiology related. So that was after that experience. It was actually when I found Morton's posting online, looking for an assistant winemaker.
So just to put this in perspective, this vineyard gig that you had, what year was that? Was that around 2013?
That was the 2013 vintage. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And then I had gone through the whole 2013 vintage. That was a great vintage. I mean, looking back on it, like the fruit that I produced that year was fantastic. Even though 2013 doesn't technically go down as a good vintage, my fruit was clean and I was really happy with the end product. I did a little bit of like small batch production for Stony Run, but I don't know if that ever became of anything. But I was mostly just growing that fruit for Pinnacle Ridge and then also helping Larry expand his vineyard. So we ended up that the 2014 spring, we ended up planting some 25 odd acres or something like that.
Wow.
And then I left in the spring and I joined Ravines and Morton in April, I believe.
Sorry to bring you back.
July.
I know that the 2013 the Finger Lakes was a pretty cool vintage, but I don't remember if it was also particularly wet. What was it like in Pennsylvania?
Very similar. Pennsylvania runs along the same lines as the Finger Lakes. I think it's just that there's, it's if you can stretch almost a straight line, well, it's kind of slightly diagonal. It's a little bit, Finger Lakes is a little bit more west than where I was at, but climate wise, we see a lot of the same things. Lehigh Valley area where I was at was about a week ahead as far as like picking and ripening time for harvest. 2013, I believe it was cool. Not overly wet, and that's probably why I had such good fruit that year. But there were a couple of storms that came through during that vintage, kind of later in the vintage. So early season stuff, I just remember in my mind, Chardonnay and Pinot coming off just beautiful. And then kind of mid-season stuff kind of like floundered a little bit, but then the late season stuff we were able to hang on. Well, I guess we just hung it for so long because it was so cool. But yeah, overall, like a pretty solid vintage. But yeah, it does go down in the books as one of those cooler ones. But you'll have that.
Yeah,
I like those
course.
vintages.
Oh, that's what makes our region beautiful, I think, is the vintage variation, or it's one of the things that I like about it.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry to get you off track. So then you replied to a job posting or got the gig at Ravines.
Yep. I left the vineyard management position and wanted to get back in the winery. In our area, in the Lehigh Valley, at that time, all the wineries were quite small. Most of them were barely breaking, I would think, 10,000 cases. They really didn't have open winemaking positions because at this time, most of the people had started their second career were the winemakers and they didn't need to hire on anyone. So I started looking in other regions to get into the winery, and the Finger Lakes was one of those regions where it was, the wineries are big enough that they can bring in outside winemaking help. And so I just randomly applied to Ravines. I knew nothing about Ravines at that point in time. Morton had gotten back to me and said he was interested. I went up to meet him and had my interview, and it seemed like a match made in heaven. I actually accepted the job without actually having a place to live up there. Yeah.
Well, it's a kind of a compliment to the relationship that you perceived with Ravines, or maybe with the region, that you felt so confident about the opportunity that you were prepared to do that.
Yeah. And I knew I wanted to stay. I latched onto this idea of cool climate winemaking pretty early on. I had consumed California wines and West Coast wines, and it was just too warm and a little uninteresting to me. So I always kind of kept this like cool climate winemaking in the back of my mind, and I knew I wanted to stick within those regions. And that's followed me through to the point that I'm at in my career today. So the Finger Lakes seemed like just the perfect opportunity. And to be fair, I really didn't know that much about the Finger Lakes until I got up there. And it was it was a good match, and it was a good chance to really stay within a local region that I was interested in, but still be able to be employed full time. That was always the tricky part is, around my area, there just wasn't anything. There wasn't the opportunities that there are today. I mean, today's significantly better. A lot of those original people that started their second career they're now retired, and now the industry is opening up a little bit more.
Looking for more young adults to fill positions.
Yep, and we're starting to see some younger people filter in, some people that have good experiences from around the world, and I think that's pushing our industry forward in the best possible sense.
So what was your you spent a couple of years at Ravines, right?
Yeah, I always say roughly 6 years, but it probably wasn't quite that long. I was there from 2014 to 2020, but when you're talking vintages, it's a bit gray area, I guess.
Sure. Well, I knew some of your history before I asked you to repeat it all to me, but I didn't realize how many wineries you had spent time with in one capacity or another as you were leading your way up to Ravine. So at that point, that would have been the longest stint, it sounds like, at any one place. How was that experience for you in comparison to some of your others or some of the ones that you've experienced since?
Yeah, I mean, it's ultimately the experience that has molded and shaped my winemaking style and my winemaking mindset.
Interesting.
Through my career beyond that. And not only that, when I was up there for those 6 years, I did the 2 harvests overseas as well too. So that was the real game changer, the real buckle down, get serious, and really starting to focus on my palate, my winemaking style, what I actually wanted to make, what I didn't want to make. I always had like an inclination of, what I didn't want to make, but I wasn't 100% set on what I really wanted to make, and that really helped shape and mold that style in my mind.
Sure. You mentioned that you did a couple internships in the Southern Hemisphere. What were those like? Tell me about those.
So the first one I did was that was the 2016 harvest in New Zealand. I went to a winery. It was kind of a double winery. It was a winery that was just acquired by another winery, and it was Greystone Muddy Water, which was in Canterbury, New Zealand, about an hour north of Christchurch. And when I tell people I was in New Zealand, did you make Sauvignon Blanc? Nah, we made 1 tank of Sauvignon Blanc. I would say 80% of our production was actually Pinot Noir. It was a really big Pinot Noir region, and they had their Greystone vineyards and then also our Muddy Water vineyards. And then we did a little bit of custom crush from some other vineyards, but all were very starkly different. And that was kind of the experience that really started to shape my mind as far as terroir influence on the wine itself. We had super heavy clay sites and we had super lean sandy sites, and being able to taste through those ferments as they were going was a really good eye opener. And also at the same time, that was also my first experience with biodynamic and organic winemaking, which I think is applicable to our area to an extent, but not to the full extent.
Because of some of the differences in like disease pressure and stuff that we experience?
Yeah, it was very, very dry there. And one thing that I did take away from New Zealand as well, too, is it was still a warmer region than our area. In my opinion, it was a lot, the daytime heat was a lot higher and they were getting a lot less rainfall. And so I was kind of determined to find something that was a little bit closer to our growing conditions. And then so from there, I did my second internship in Tasmania, which is very maritime influenced climate, but they get quite a bit of rain. Although I was there for one of their drier seasons, that was there for like their 2012 type season. But that was in my opinion, a lot closer to the kind of climate that we were working with. And again, that was another place where we were growing a lot of Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Riesling was another big one, Pinot Gris was another big variety for them. And these were all the varieties that I was interested in working with. So that's why I chose to go down even farther south.
Interesting. So after Ravines, what was next for you?
After Ravines, I had left
Well, maybe
Ravines.
if you don't mind me asking, what was your feeling in your mind to look for the next thing? Like, what were you looking for when you were considering a change in scenery and opportunity?
Yeah, actually, it was kind of a global thing that really kind of influenced me quite a bit. I left Ravines in 2020, pretty much
I
right
wonder what
after.
that global thing was.
Yeah, that global thing of 2020. COVID had just hit, and I don't know, things kind of seemed up in the air around the world, and I had a desire to get back closer to home, and an opportunity had opened up at Flino Estates in my hometown. Was actually like a mile from my childhood home, and my father had planted the vineyard there, and he was the vineyard manager there up until 2019. And it just seemed like a good chance to get back home, get back closer to family, and the opportunity to work with both my father's vineyard at that point and the vineyard that he had planted was really, really enticing. It was a new facility, a new winery. In fact, they had just built their facility right before I got there. Before that, they were kind of garage making outfit. Um, and then they had built their brand new winery. We jumped from 13,000 gallons of tank space to 56,000 gallons of tank space.
Wow.
And that facility was never operated prior to my arrival. So it was like a bit of a learning curve. Like, you build these facilities and you think everything's just going to be absolutely perfect. And then you start to actually work it and you realize that, you need to adjust your what you're doing in the cellar to fit the facility. And so that was a big learning curve.
Yeah, I
Um,
have to
I had
imagine.
I
Sorry,
had
go ahead.
left Ravines as like, a cellar hand working underneath Morton, but really close to Morton. Not a cellar hand. I was the assistant winemaker. I was kind of offered the winemaking position under Morton prior to my departure, but I always kind of considered myself as the assistant to Morton the whole time, and always having someone to check back with and make sure that you're doing the right thing, and then to move to a brand new facility with no one above me. um that was a big jump. That was a jump from you're the person doing the tasks to you're the person making the decisions and doing the tasks.
Yeah, I was just speaking. Well, maybe I'd said it in a couple podcasts, but I started making some of my own wine. And one of the experiences that I had, one of the learning opportunities that I had in doing that was going into making my own wine, feeling like I had done this 100 times and I was educated and had enough experience to be able to know what choices to make and how it was all going to look and play out. And then I got the grapes and I suddenly felt a little bit like frozen with decision making. And it was something that I didn't expect until I was put in that position. When you made that jump and now all of a sudden you're the decision making guy, what was that for you from like a human perspective? Did you feel really confident going into it? Or what was the learning curve like?
I mean, I would say to take on a position like that with the amount of experience that I had was a bit of a jump in all reality. But I just leaned back on what I had learned at Ravines, what I had learned from my previous experiences. And it just kind of pushed me to just trust myself. And I knew that I had done all the work before, and I knew that I had been asking all the questions all along the way. And when the time came, it was a bit daunting and a little bit terrifying, because especially that first vintage is like, am I doing the right thing here? Am
Yeah,
I
it's
making the
all on
right
you, fam.
choices?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that was definitely nerve-wracking, but after that first vintage comes out and everyone's like, "Oh, these wines are great." And it's like, okay, I can continue to trust myself a little bit more. And so I really leaned heavily on all the experiences that I had leading up until that point. And um, that was kind of the point in my career that really solidified, okay, you can do this, and you are making good wine, and people appreciate the product that you're delivering to them. And if the people like it, that's all that matters. That's really all that matters to me. If the people enjoy drinking what you're producing, then you're doing something right.
Totally. I mean, that's the end goal. The one thing that I know about that facility, I came and visited you, I think at least twice at the Felino Estate Winery. And the one thing that stood out to me, and I know that we've discussed in the past, has been that whoever set up that facility, it was all VC, variable capacity tanks. And really, I'm just wondering, I think people in the industry, for people who maybe don't know, some people refer to variable capacity tanks as variable catastrophe tanks, because there's this notion that they're less trustworthy, which like inherently they are, I suppose, philosophically speaking. They have a lid that has a gasket around the outside so it can move up and down and change the volume that it holds. Well, that just introduces a potential point of failure. I've never worked with any, and I've asked a couple other people who have worked with them what their experience is like. And my recollection is that when you went to this place, you were feeling a little bit unnerved, I think, by the fact that they didn't have like one, they were all of the tanks in this place, or the vast majority of them were this variable capacity style. In the end, after having spent a couple of years there, I mean, you were obviously able to make tasty wine using them. How did your opinion change on your relationship with variable capacity tanks?
Yeah, I mean, I was pretty lucky. At Ravines, we didn't have any VC tanks, you know that. And when I went to New Zealand, no VC tanks. When I went to Tassie, no VC tanks. Where I got experience working with VC tanks was actually at Cedar Ridge or Blair Vineyards, which was my first harvest. And that's how I kind of learned to deal with VC tanks. And, without that experience, I think I probably would have pulled all my hair out, because I would just not really known, how to work with these types of tanks. I think they have a good place in the industry, especially for like growing regions, because it gives you the ability to keep tanks topped. I'm throwing quotes out there, topped, particularly when you don't know how much fruit you're bringing in. When I went to Ravines, we essentially knew the volume of fruit we were bringing in. We knew we had the tanks to accommodate what was coming in from the vineyard. But in some of these newer regions like the Lehigh Valley, you don't know. And you're currently in a process of expansion, and you may only pull in 3 tons of Chardonnay this year, and you only need a 2,000 liter tank. Well, and then next year you got a new vineyard that comes online, and now you're pulling in 5 tons, and it's if you only have a 2,000 liter fixed tank, that's not the right size tank for you. So I do think there is a place for them in the industry, but you have to be a little bit more on point when working with them. I think that there's a couple of thoughts about dealing with them. The big thing is basically the lid. How do you deal with the lid? The lids always leak. The gaskets that hold the lid in place always leak. Um, do you leave the lid above the wine and continually gas them every week? Do you float the lid? I think a lot of people have their own opinions about it. For me, I always thought of it as I float the lids. Um,
Try and keep as little air in there as possible.
Exactly. And you do gas tanks if you have headspace, but what I ended up doing is floating the lids and then blanketing them with gas on top of the lid.
Oh, interesting.
a little bit of argon on top. And you just have to keep in mind that while your tank is quote unquote full and touching the surface of the lid, you have so much more surface area than a fixed capacity tank that has this tiny little chimney. And, you know, the chimney surface area compared to the amount of surface area a VC tank creates is your main source of the problem. And then you just have to stay on top of them every week. You're checking your lids, making sure that they stay inflated, because oftentimes they'll get a pinhole leak. And, if you're not on top of it, you could go 3 weeks and find out that your gasket is gone and your wine is now being exposed to oxygen. And, if you're not checking them on a regular basis, that was certainly something that you had to be aware of.
Yeah, I can just picture myself in that position, laying in bed at night, being like, God, I hope all of the lids are still tight. Like,
yeah,
needing to stop myself from going back to the winery at 10 p.m. just to repump everything, just to make sure that it's all tight.
Yeah, I know some people have put in. They've actually hooked their lids up to like their air compressors, and so their air compressor will continually keep the lids inflated.
Like at
the
a certain
theory
pressure.
is that they should never deflate, but in reality, they do. And you just have to stay on top of it. But yeah, it was, they were a blessing and a curse. I got to do some interesting ferments. Like I made a port wine for Felinos, and I basically fermented out I think it was Primitivo Zinfandel. Primitivo, or also known as Zinfandel, for a port wine, and I fermented it out for, I think it was about a month, and then I dropped the lid on the entire ferment, sealed it up, and I let it soak for 2 months on skins, just kind of hanging out in there. And if that was a VC tank, I don't think I would have made that call. Or if it was a fixed capacity tank, I don't think I would have made that call. But since it was a VC tank and I could drop the lid right onto it, it actually worked out pretty well, and I got some really good extraction out of that. So that was, again, it's a blessing and a curse. If I was designing a winery for tomorrow for myself, I would not use them, but they do have their place in the industry, and they are quite versatile for what they are.
Yeah, interesting. This fortified wine that you made, I assume when you say port wine, it was a fortified red.
Yeah.
Well,
sorry.
we know it's red. No, it's no. I'm just because I want to ask you a question. I want to be sure that I'm on the same track as you. Yeah, 2 months skin contact. That's a long time. It's really interesting to hear you say that. The question that comes to mind, as I've spoken with a couple of other colleagues who have made fortified red wines, is did you add the alcohol like midway through the fermentation to stop it, or did you like fortify and then add sugar after it had fermented bone dry?
Yeah, I added the alcohol mid ferment. So I was just kind of trying to hit my sugar target. These were actually grapes that came in from the West Coast. And they were pretty high bricks. I think I was at like 28 bricks on that. And I fermented
28,
it.
That's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, the grapes screamed, "Make me into port."
Well, that makes more sense about the 2 months of skin contact, because the phenolics and everything would be so ripe.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Primitivo, aka Zinfandel, is it's that jammy character. That's over the top fruit. It was West Coast fruit. The fruit was over the top.
Oh, my mouth is watering for this.
Yeah. And so it was more about hitting that sugar to alcohol balance, which is kind of hard to predict. But again, I made several ports at Ravines, and I just kind of fell back on that experience that I had making the ports style wines that we made at Ravines, and just targeted a particular range of sugar that I thought the market would accept. And once I hit that point, then the alcohol goes in and you're done on ferment. That's that seals the deal. Once you throw that alcohol in, that's it.
For anybody following along, there are a couple ways to make a fortified red wine, and one of the more common, and I don't know if it's like the traditional way, but the way that I've had experiences in the same way that Darrin has at Ravines is to actually stop the fermentation partway through by adding strong alcohol, typically in the 90% range, which, the yeast don't like. And the point is to keep some of the natural sugar that's in the grapes to sweeten the wine. And you can boost the alcohol by supplementing with this distilled spirit. Versus I assume that there are other people. I don't think I've spoken with anybody yet who has done it this way, who you could ferment the wine totally dry and then add back sugar and slightly less alcohol. I'm not sure what the stylistic distinction is. I would love to speak with somebody in the future who maybe has had experiences and can speak to both, but just wanted to add that little detail there.
I think actually, if I could add some experience to that,
Please.
think you actually, particularly as you move away from the Finger Lakes into some of these newer regions, I think it's actually a bit more common to add the spirits after.
Really?
And then back sweeten. And from my experience between tasting the difference of the two, the sooner you can make any addition or adjustment to the wine prior or during ferment, the less it stands out on its own individual expression when you taste it. So if you can add the alcohol sooner, it actually feels a little bit less expressed, as opposed to adding that alcohol later. You kind of taste that alcohol more. It feels less integrated. The sugar feels less integrated. And I think for me, it's always been about that integration. So whenever I'm making any sort of addition to a wine, if I need to make any correction, try and get it in as soon as you can, and it'll integrate itself into the wine so much more than if you try to make a big adjustment post fermentation.
Sure.
If you can get those yeast working on the collective whole of the solution, they'll integrate whatever it is you've added to that solution so much more than if we just added, straight alcohol into a finished wine.
That was always my understanding as well for additions of all kinds. Specifically, what the one that comes to mind that I hear about online is acid additions. People are always wondering when to acidify. And I was always under the impression of exactly what you just said, that it was stylistically more appropriate to add during fermentation, and that it would help with the integration. And so to hear you say that, it makes total sense to me. The other thing that goes through my mind is, to taste the difference between grape juice, and wine. They're like hardly comparable. And so I feel like there must be a stylistic distinction created by the fact that you're not allowing fermentation to continue all the way, and that must add to maybe some of the juiciness of the finished wine and the richness in the body. And I don't know, now I'm just guessing, but
no, I mean, I totally agree with you. Like I said, when I made that port wine at Felino's, the grapes came in at 28 Brix, which means I don't have to add any sugar in any way, shape, or form. And I think that makes a huge difference because, if you're just adding sugar, you're strictly just adding sugar for the purpose of having alcohol. But to get sugar in the form of juice, it's coming with flavor compounds within the juice. It's not just straight sugar. So at 28 Brix, I could afford to ferment that wine out to, I think I fermented it close to like 14% alcohol. And then I boosted the alcohol up to 18.5, 19. And I was able to, there was so much sugar in the initial juice that I was able to just retain some of the sugar present, rather than trying to add it back in later. And for me, it feels more integrated. It feels more cohesive. It feels like it's not just an addition later, but actually part of the wine and part of the style of the wine. That being said, had those grapes come to me at 24 Brix, I don't know if I could have gone the same route that I did. I probably would have ended up adding more alcohol, to be honest, to keep some of the sugar. I guess a better example would be if it came in at like 21 Brix. And you ferment it out at 21 bricks, you're looking at 12% alcohol. And now I've got to boost that up to 18 if you fermented it dry. And then I don't have any sugar left over to balance out the rest of the wine. So I needed that really high sugar in the initial juice in order to construct the style of wine that I was trying to make. And I think that's a big part of it. You know, when I've made port style wines at Ravines, it was always with fruit that we hung for a long time, probably beyond your normal picking date, just to get those sugars up so that we didn't have to make that adjustment with grain sugar later.
Sure. You know, the the conversation we were having about when to add things and how they relate to how additions integrate with the wine, it makes me wonder. I've also had experiences and thoughts in the past on the different effect of a off dry wine. Specifically, the experiences that I've had were with Riesling, and the difference between leaving some of the natural sugar that was present in the juice as the sugar in the finished wine that is the RS that you end up tasting versus adding sugar. I wonder if there's that same integration consideration with sweetness as well, along with these other things that we've mentioned, alcohol and acid. I think that there probably is.
I would have to agree with you. I mean, for me, I feel like you could definitely taste when sugar is added after fermentation to balance out the wine versus keeping some of that natural sugar retained in the wine. Just kind of
You think it's more elegant?
yeah, that's a perfect way to put it. It's certainly more elegant, but overall it's just cohesive. It's a collective whole of the group. It's not an individual component. And even I think you also gain an advantage if you're adding sugar prior to fermentation. So if you got really low bricks coming in, I would advise to add your sugar up front and give it the opportunity to become part of the collective whole sooner, rather than, just deciding to throw some sugar at a finished wine and being like, yeah, that seems better. It's yeast are magical little creatures, and their ability to make the mix a lot better mixed. It's when they're in solution and doing their job, they're not just converting sugar to alcohol. They're, it's like sticking your wine through a blender almost. But they're blending it and they're making it for you. And if you can get that in there sooner, they're going to do a lot better job of mixing sugar into wine than we could ever do with a Guth mixer mixing sugar into wine.
Back from a small technical break. So now, please, would you tell me about your transition from Foligno Estate to William Heritage? I think that you didn't have anything in between, did you?
Nope. I moved immediately from Heritage from Foligno's to Heritage. The move was, I enjoyed my time at Foligno's. They gave me a lot of freedom, a lot of opportunity to experiment, and really push my style and what I was trying to make. But one of the things that kind of set me back a little, not set me back, but made me reconsider a little bit as far as staying at Foligno's, was I was working with a lot of fruit from the West Coast, and all throughout my career, and PA is unique for this, not just PA, but the lower Northeast is kind of unique for this. Like in New York, you can only make wine from New York grapes, but in Pennsylvania, you can make wine from grapes all over the world if you really want to. And there's a lot of people that run this business model that way, is, they import grapes from Italy and South America and California. And for me, I always loved our East Coast grapes. I always loved knowing exactly which blocks the grapes came from, and I wanted to work with grapes that were from here. So I put in my time at Felino's. I believe I did great things for them as far as helping them develop a winemaking style going forward. But I really only wanted to work with cool climate East Coast grapes. And that's just been kind of the backbone to my whole career. That's why I went to Tassie instead of doing another harvest in New Zealand, is because Tassie was cooler. It was closer to what we were making back home. And I would get these grapes from California, and, the numbers seem so foreign to me. I get stuff in that was, 25 and a half bricks. And that was, standard, normal, pretty good. But you don't see that here on the East Coast. So, well, maybe down in Virginia, but, so I wanted to get back to kind of what I really, cut my teeth on and really worked with my entire career. So that was kind of the deciding piece that made me move to Heritage. COVID had also ended as well too, so it was like, man, I didn't really need to be around home that close. And I knew of Heritage. I had actually stopped in Heritage. I don't know if you remember this, but at one point in time, I did a little consulting for a winery in Jersey while I was up at Ravines.
I don't remember.
Yeah, it was a small startup winery, and they had just started up and had zero experience in the industry. And they had a winemaker who I believe kind of knew what they were doing, but then that winemaker departed, and then they were kind of stuck and couldn't really get someone in. I think they've definitely gotten someone in since then, but I had been in contact with them, and at that time it was I almost entertained the idea of going on and working for them, but then I got down to their winery and it just wasn't my cup of tea. They weren't ready for the experience that I was going to offer them. But I did do some consulting for them just to kind of keep them moving forward, just making sure that their wines were safe and protected, showed them how to do sulfur testing and stuff like that, made sure they were topping their barrels. Anyways, during my time traveling down there, I was commuting from the Finger Lakes down to there, and I had driven past Heritage Winery, and I had stopped in and tasted their wines, and I was definitely impressed. And this was probably back in 2018. It was about that time, 2017, 2018. So they were on my radar. And then my parents also like to travel to different wine regions, so they would bring back wines, and they had traveled to Jersey and tasted through a bunch of the wineries in Jersey, and I was generally overall very impressed with the caliber of wines that were coming out of Heritage. And so they popped up on my radar while I was at Felino's, and it just kind of seemed like a place that I really wanted to transition to. It's a sixth generation farm, fifth generation farm. Well, I think actually currently the sixth is in play. Whatever. It's been in the family for a while. And it was originally a fruit farm in Jersey. They were growing a lot of apples and peaches and plums and pears. And so I currently work with the sons of the family, and it was their father that transitioned the farm, Bill Heritage. He transitioned the farm from a fruit farm to a vineyard. We still have some fruit trees on site, and they started their wine production with fruit involved. But after that, well, we still do some fruit, but now it's the main focus for the farm is the vineyard and the wine that they're producing. And it was a good change for me to move from an operation where we were just kind of a winery at Felino's and buying in. We had a small vineyard at Felino's, but it wasn't a big vineyard, to a place like Heritage where the primary focus was actually on growing the fruit, and the property on the fruit on the farm. And it was a good shift for me, because that's kind of where my heart kind of fell. Is, it has a sense of place. And um, I know every block that the fruit comes from. And um, that was a positive change in what I wanted to be doing in my career. So that's what kind of spurred that on. It was just the transition from, you know, unknown vineyards fruit coming from unknown vineyards out west, to um, driving through the vineyard every day and knowing exactly where that fruit is coming from. For me, that was wildly important, and it played a big influence in my decision, um, switching to heritage. Um,
I think the website said something like 150 acres of a state vineyard. Is that right?
the farm's 150 acres.
Oh, the
We probably
farm.
have about 70 acres planted, with vineyards. And then there's probably another, I honestly don't know, but I would have to guess 15 to 20 acres of fruit trees still on the property. It's a farm property. It's, the backbone of the family is farming. And to me, that's the most important part of the winemaking. I mean, I tasted their wines back in 2018. They were fantastic. And that was one winemaker. And then I tasted the wines from the winemaker that was before me, and those were fantastic. And I, I can only screw it up. But what that tells me is it's the farm is producing good fruit, and that's the most important part. And that's what I want to be involved in, because, as it seems so cliche, but every winemaker says the most important thing about making wine is having good fruit. But it's 100% true. And I can look back through these other winemakers that were here before me, and they were all making very good wines. I know nothing about their practices, what they were doing, but that tells me, regardless of who the winemaker is in that position, the farm is producing very good fruit. And I think that's a very important concept, um, to be a good winemaker, is connect yourself with the right vineyards that are producing good fruit, and you can't go wrong.
Yeah, good wine is grown. That was one of the first things that I was ever told when I got in the cellar at Ravines was it takes good wine, good fruit to make good wine, and you can certainly ruin good grapes in the winery.
Correct. Yeah, and even at Felino's, I mean, when I was at Felino's, I had reconstructed a bunch of their wines using fruit that I had worked with from Ravines. I don't know if you remember, but at one point in time, Ravines was getting fruit from Serenity Vineyards.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you were on board at that point, but those were great grapes. That was a fantastic vineyard site, and I brought that fruit came on the market, and I brought that fruit down to Felino's, and it drastically changed the quality level of a bunch of their wines, because I was incorporating that fruit into their program.
Sure.
So that was a big part of my success at Felino's. And then, yeah, it's, everyone always says good fruit makes good wine.
That's what they say.
It's such a cliche thing. And I just hate repeating it all the time, but it's so true.
I guess some cliches are that way because they're proven. As I was looking through the William Heritage wine on their website, they had a couple of varieties that I wasn't expecting to see. Specifically, I wrote some down: Semillon, Petit Manseng, Petit Verdot. Those are grown on the property.
The Petit Manseng is the only one of the group that isn't grown on the property. That is, so we have vineyard that is farmed by another company, that's a mile from our tasting room, a mile from our vineyards. And so we get a little bit of Petit Manseng and some Sauvignon Blanc from them. Other than that, everything else is grown on the property. And just kind of following up with what you just said, there was a lot of varieties here that I was actually very unfamiliar with.
Oh, Viognier was another one that I saw.
Viognier. We had some Pinot Meunier.
Really?
And I think that's kind of one of the things that I really like about the family is they're willing to experiment. They realize that they're, in a younger region that's still developing, and so they're still experimenting and trying to plant new things. So next year we're going to have some Arcazzatelli come online and some Saperavi come online. So that's great. They're open to trying new things and not just like locked and set in their ways. And I think I can confidently say that both Pennsylvania and New York or New Jersey are, they're still a developing grape region. While we've been growing grapes in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and New York for that matter for a long time, we haven't really defined ourselves, and we haven't really defined what grape varieties. Like, I think the Finger Lakes, you guys are very lucky to be like, yeah, we figured out Riesling works. We figured out Cabernet Franc works. But down here, we're just a little bit warmer Riesling. I mean, most of the Rieslings down here, in my opinion, are definitely subpar compared to what they're doing in the Finger Lakes. So we're just still kind of up in the open, and
Interesting.
we have to be open to new grape varieties and maybe varieties that people aren't so familiar with, but they might be, the one that really clicks in. And you can see the same thing down in Virginia. They've kind of locked in Petit Manseng and Petit Verdot as kind of like their grapes that they feel are their strong suits. Viognier too, for that matter. But I think kind of in this mid Northeast region, Maryland to Pennsylvania, it's still a bit up in the air, and you just have to be open to experimentation and trying new things and seeing what works and seeing what doesn't. So, I don't know of too many people in the area that are growing Arcazzatelli or Saperavi or even Chenin Blanc for that matter. Pinot Meunier, these are all great varieties that most people aren't really discussing too much, but they show promise. And we just have to keep trying. And, some grapes are going to be flops and some grapes are just going to hit that money spot, and you're going to know it when you taste the wines and see the grapes come in. And I very much enjoy the fact that the family is trying so many different things. And I think we have a good idea of some of our really strong suits, and some stuff is still kind of in the experimental phase, but like, yeah, it's looking pretty promising. And we plant an additional vineyard of those varieties. So like a good one would be Chenin Blanc. For us, it seems to be, we're warm enough, we've got nice sandy soils. Chenin seems to take very well to our vineyard sites. Same with Sauvignon Blanc. You really don't see a whole lot of Sauvignon Blanc up in the Finger Lakes. Maybe here and there, it's kind of spotty, but down here, it's the wines are definitely showing that the vines are taking well to the sites that they're in, and you only find that out through experimentation.
Yeah, of course. Well, it sounds like first, that's the price of experimentation, is that you inevitably have some flops, but it's beneficial for the greater good, both for you and for the region, to be able to have some experiences with other varieties and determine what works and what doesn't. It totally makes sense to me. It's really interesting. It makes me really want to come taste some of these wines, both because I'm relatively unfamiliar with some of these varieties, but also to be in that phase where you're, I mean, not you, but a region is kind of finding itself and experimenting like that, I think is a really interesting time to go and taste wine. And it seems like a opportunity ripe for an educational tasting for me.
Yeah, no, definitely come down and taste. I mean, And for me, it's like a lot of those varieties I haven't worked with. You know, I was working primarily with Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Riesling, Cab Franc, Merlot, Cab Sauv. That was, you know, the backbone of the grapes that I had worked with up until
Yeah,
this
you're
point.
talking Finger Lakes.
Yeah. And then I get down
How?
here and you get Chenin Blanc. I've tasted a lot of Chenin Blanc, but I've never made one.
Yeah.
Semillon, never made one. I grew Pinot Meunier back in 2013.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I interviewed Ian Barry from 680 Cellars here in the Finger Lakes, and he has some Pinot Meunier in the vineyard there. And he said he thinks of it as Pinot Noir's unwashed cousin or something, unbathed cousin or something like that. He said it was like a particularly rustic Pinot. What's your experience been like?
I would have to agree with Ian as far as on the winemaking side.
And he said it grew like Pinot in the vineyard.
It grows exactly like Pinot. In fact, the only way you can really tell if you got Pinot Meunier in the vineyard versus Pinot Noir is early spring when you get bud break. The Pinot Meunier comes out with it has like a white fuzz to the leaves.
Interesting.
So I distinctly remember when I was back at Stony Run, we had full block, and it was planted with all different clones of Pinot Noir, and then there was also Pinot Meunier. And you look across the block, and everything's green, but then you get to the Pinot Meunier, and it's actually white looking.
Weird.
And it's very, very distinct and kind of just stands out just a little bit.
How cool.
And, yeah, that kind of stuck in my mind as like, oh, that's such a unique thing. And, you know, I loved that Pinot Meunier from that vineyard site there. It was just kind of like, I don't know, from being so early in my career, it's just kind of one of those things that kind of stuck into my mind. And, but as far as like making the Pinot Meunier wine, we turn it into sparkling. So that's its traditional role. We do a fair bit of traditional method sparkling, and I think that's mostly why we have Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier and Chardonnay planted on the property is to work with sparkling. And our traditional sparkling program has shined numerous times, and we do about a 5-year aging program on that, no dosage, and they're beautiful.
They all on principle get no dosage.
Yep.
Well, they must get dosage, but no sugar.
No dosage.
Really? So they just get disgorged, no addition.
That's it.
So interesting.
Yep. I think the wines develop quite well and quite easily, and I probably the lack of sulfur going back into the bottle at the dosage phase maybe shortens their lifespan slightly, but the freshness and the purity of the wine itself warrants that. And you know, we don't need to make a sparkling wine that lasts 20 years. You lose all your bubbles anyways. So
yeah, it's all going to be drank long before that.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
How has your philosophy and winemaking style needed to change at all as you moved from state to state and dealt with different varieties in slightly different climates? Or do you feel like you kind of have your wine philosophy and you just apply it to these separate places?
I certainly have a backbone to my philosophy, and it's KISS. Keep it simple, stupid.
Sounds like when I interviewed Paul Brock, he talked a lot about getting out of the way.
Yeah. You know, the grapes are going to tell you what they want to be made into. So for the most part, step back and let them do their thing. But I've had to change my approach moving from place to place, particularly with Felinos. And Felinos is where I experienced West Coast fruit kind of for the first time, the super ripe region fruit. And that was a roller coaster ride because I saw things that I had never seen before in my entire career. I mean, you get some fruit in that's like +4 pH.
Whoa.
Yes. And that was the first time I've seen it, but it's, it's fairly common for out there. And you get fruit in that's 26, 27 bricks, 28 bricks.
That's
And
insane.
you're expected to make a dry style red wine with that. And it's, it's nerve wracking, and it's, it put into gear things that were not in my wheelhouse. So I definitely had to step back and just take a second look at the approach that I was taking for making those wines. But when it comes to wines that are grown within the states and within the regions that I've worked in, I agree with Paul. You just step back and let the grapes speak for themselves. Let the wine speak for itself. You kind of you're just an usher at that point, and you're just making sure that you don't mess it up along the way. So yeah, I've definitely had to reevaluate my style along the way, but there are like backbone core things that I tend to stick to. Perfect example is, getting additions in early, getting that integration in early that sticks with all my wines that I make. Another great example is blending, complexity in blending and complexity in variation. If you can make a wine, if you can make a single varietal wine with 3-4 different yeasts, it's not the work. It's going to help you. And it adds complexity to the wine itself. And, that I try to do that as much as I can, but then also at the same time, you're also working within the facility. The facility that I worked at in Felino's was a wildly different facility than I'm at now. Felino's was brand new, all new tanks that didn't make any sense. And here at Heritage, it's an old farm that's been converted into a winery that's, bits and bobs and pieces everywhere. So you need to adapt to your facility as well, too. Like if you're just going to walk into a facility and say, I'm going to do the same thing I did at this other facility, but you're not equipped for it, you're undercutting yourself at that point. So it's a matter of adapting to the fruit, but also where you're working and who you're working with, and your capabilities, and seeing what resources you have at your disposal. I think is also a driving force.
Sure. Something else that I wanted to ask you from a winemaking point of view, because it's something that I have very little experience with doing, and I want to understand more about and gain more people's perspective, is specifically dealing with. I know that William Heritage makes a couple of wines that are a little bit more approachable and have a slightly lower price point, and some of them have more residual sugar. They're slightly sweeter wines, and I've always heard that making sweet wine is harder than making dry wine, and I think that must be a fact, because you're dealing with issues of stability and stopping yeast from wanting to re-ferment and that sort of thing. And I've had very little opportunity to try and make any sweet wine, and so I'm interested from a winemaking perspective on some of the logistics that go into that. So basically, how do you deal with that? How can you safely store and either when you make these sweet wines, are you stopping them or are you back sweetening? And then is it just filtration and KMBS, or are you adding what's that other thing that stops yeast from multiplying? Are you having to add any sorbate? What's you must be bottling through a sterile filter. Can you just tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So first off, the William Heritage brand were mostly, I would say 90% low sugar wines, non-sweet wines, dry wines. It's our other brand, the Jersey brand, that is the sweeter brand.
Right. I should have made that distinction, just that you're related to these wines and not that they're the William Heritage brand.
Yeah. So when dealing with these sweeter wines, it's definitely more nerve-wracking. It's a bit of an unknown territory, not unknown, but I like you do not have extensive experience with these sweeter wines. But coming from Pennsylvania, this is the same common practice that we have in PA. The general population likes to drink these type of wines, and so for us, um, it is sugar added post ferment. We cross flow all of our wines, and then we sterile filter everything.
For people who don't
And
know, crossflow is a type of filter.
yep, yep, and it's a glorious filter, and everyone should invest in one because they are. I would not if I was plate and framing these wines. I would. I don't want to say what I would do, but
It would make you upset.
it would make me very upset. Yes, because a lot of them they have, they have compounds in them that we typically don't see within just grapes. So you have a lot of extra pectins and a lot of glucans and
Things that make them a particular pain to filter.
yeah, they're very similar to trying to filter native and hybrid grapes. Every time that Nerey hits ravines, it's like a little bit more annoying to get that through the filter than say the dry Riesling.
Mm-hmm.
And just multiply that times 10, and now you're dealing with some of these fruit wines. um, so yeah, it's cross flow, membrane sterile filtered at bottling. So we cross flow the a day or two before, and then sulfurs we keep high, 40 ppm on those.
Some people are laughing at 40 ppm called high.
Yeah.
Some people who are going into bottle at 70 across the board are like,
yeah. I mean, maybe you could argue going in at 70, but the fact that we sterile filter going into bottle, I feel comfortable at 40. And we're also adding sorbate. So it's a double-edged sword. So if we weren't adding the sorbate and we weren't sterile filtering at bottling, then yeah, I'm going in at 70.
you need to bump it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But for us, 40 works because we have those other two, fallbacks in place. And, without those, I would not feel comfortable bottling this wine, but we use them because it lets us sleep at night a little bit better.
Yeah. You kind of have to. I mean, it really is true that making dry wine is easier. I mean, it just finishes fermentation and then it's done, and stability issues are less. And
yeah,
it's funny to think because of I think the a lot of the opinion of people in the wine production space, especially of the place in the mind of wine drinkers that sweeter wines hold. They're typically not held with the same regard, sometimes unfairly, but they're harder to make. It's kind of backwards.
Yeah, and our cellar practices have to be on point. I mean, if I was bottling a dry Riesling tank, when I'm done bottling it, I'll just rinse out the tank with hot water and we're good to go for whatever's coming in next. When you're dealing with these wines, like we're using a lot more chemicals in the cellar to make sure that things are as clean and as sterile as they can possibly be. We sanitize with ozone. We're using oxyper and citric washes between every time one of these wines goes into tank. And it's extra steps, it's extra processes that I personally don't feel I need to do with a dry wine. But when it comes to dealing with some of these sweeter wines, it's particularly a product like the Jersey wines where the bulk of them are sold wholesale going out to the market. You just have to be 100% positive, on point with your sanitation practices within the cellar, to make sure that you don't have issues that crop up later once the wines are in bottle. And you have to be doing that from the very step where it's fermented all the way to the very step where it's bottled. And I feel like with some of the dry wines, because they're dry, because of the nature of the composition of those wines, it's not that you don't have to be clean. It's you don't have to overkill it to be safe going into bottle.
Sure. They're inherently less problematic, it seems like. I mean, you can't have sugar hiding out in nooks and crannies where microorganisms want to do things to it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So when it comes to dealing with these sweet wines, overkill it. I overkill all of it. I know that I'm overkilling it, but I don't want to underkill it. So I would much rather overkill it on the sanitation side than underkill it, because if you underkill it, then you have a major problem on your hands, and it's a lot harder to clean that up after it's been in bottle than if you just overkilled it in the first place.
I'll tell you what, if I'm your boss listening to this podcast, I'm thinking, I knew I hired the right guy. He seems like a responsible guy. Thank you for that. Thank you for indulging me. Something else, I have basically two other questions and then a wrap-up question that I want to ask you. The first, will you tell me some of your experiences being slightly more south than we are in the Finger Lakes with spotted lanternfly? Specifically, the thing that I have in mind is a couple years ago, you sent me a video of some vineyard nets, and I think it was post-spray, and there were just a visible load of spotted lanternflies in the nets that were surrounding the canopy, and it looked like a major problem. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Will you just hit me with some of your experience?
Yeah. It's kind of wild, but one of the vineyards that I worked with was actually right at the epicenter of where the lanternflies came in. It was like a mile from the vineyard.
Whoa.
And when the lanternflies came in, not a lot of people, well, no one had experience with them. No one knew what they were going to do. No one knew if we needed to spray for them, how they would impact the grapes and the wine. And I know that some of the other vineyards that are closer to that or close to that epicenter as well are no longer in existence. So they are a serious threat to the vineyards.
Not in existence because they were damaged out of being viable.
Yep. Basically the lanternflies, they're most detrimental to the vineyard in the adult phase. In the younger nymph phase, they do some sap sucking from the leaves and stuff, and shoots, but it's very minimal impact. What really ends up happening is they do significant sap sucking in the adult phase, and that happens kind of right around harvest, mid-harvest, end of harvest, that mostly mid-harvest. And it just saps the life out of the vines going into hibernation. And then the vines just are unable to have the nutrients to rebound come next spring, and they just end up dying through the winter. So early when the lanternflies kind of hit, people were kind of like, well, these bugs are here, but we don't know if they're doing a whole lot. Looks like they're, maybe doing a little bit of piercing, but we don't think we need to spray for them. And then, the early vineyards that got hit hard that didn't spray at all, they're gone. They're non-existent. Those vines died, or too many of the vines within the vineyard died to keep the vineyard viable as a functioning vineyard. It just, you just have too many missing plants to really justify spraying a vineyard and farming a vineyard. So they just ripped them out. My dad has done quite a bit of research. Well, has been kind of on the forefront because it's quite close. The epicenter is quite close to our vineyard, his vineyard. They're very easy to deal with. They're very easy to kill. The trouble is that they're constantly moving. So you can go through your vineyard and you can use a basic insecticide and wipe them all out from your entire vineyard, and then come back the next day and it's your vineyard's totally repopulated with them because they jump from tree lines and from other places outside the vineyard. They're very mobile. It seems to be heat driven, in my opinion. So on warm days, like if we get a random warm day in, middle September, you can look up in the sky in a region that's currently being bombarded with them, and you can just see them jump from the tops of trees straight down to the vineyard. They're drawn to the vineyard. They're drawn to trees of heaven. They like to drink the sap, suck the sap of particular plants, and they know what they like, and they seem to know how to locate it. Someone told me that it's pheromone related, which I'm inclined to believe. That one lanternfly happens to find a way to get into your vineyard and leaves a pheromone trace, and the rest kind of follow.
Like, damn, this is good.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's terrifying because you go out in your vineyard and you look at the trunk of your vines, and you can have 100 of these bugs on one plant.
Jesus.
But it doesn't take much to kill them. You can use Dawn dish soap and water and just spray them, and that'll kill them.
Really?
But the thing is, they just come back.
Yeah.
And they just keep going until their life cycle ends, and then what you'll find is that they like to lay their eggs on wood and metal. So your posts, your trunks, places around the vineyard are if you think of like the wooden vineyard posts, how they're kind of like C-shaped.
Mm-hmm.
They like to plant their eggs inside that C, so you don't really see it too much, or you look at the end posts and you'll see patches of their eggs. It looks like just kind of like a mud spot. And then they hatch in the spring. When I was at Felino's, I was also running the vineyard for them, and so they hatch in the spring, and I would spray them. I would do one insecticide spray, kind of when they were like in the early nymph stage, and I would target both them and the Japanese beetles at the same time. And a lot of vineyards, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but some vineyards will spray for Japanese beetles. Some are just kind of like, oh, natural deleafing. But I would target both insects at the same time. One spray, and then I don't see any lanternflies for the rest of the season until the adult phase, which usually comes on right around the start of harvest. And then they start jumping. They come from the tree lines, and that's the hard part. So I think, particularly in Pennsylvania and Jersey and, these places where it's not like a massive wine region where there's just thousands of acres of vineyards. You have these vineyards that are planted, trees on three sides of them, and you can't go out and spray those woods. So those are the vineyards that are really being affected hard. I'm not 100% convinced that if they get into a region like Erie, PA, where you just stand on a hilltop and there's maybe one tree and then 1,000 acres of grapes, I think it'll be relatively easy for them to control, or it'll be expensive, but it's controllable. Whereas like kind of here where you just have these small little vineyards like randomly popped up here and there. And
there's also more potential habitat surrounding, you mean?
Exactly.
They can live in the trees and stuff and then jump down.
Yep. And it's when they're jumping is when they're most detrimental to the vineyards, because it's expensive to go out and spray a vineyard for anything. But if you spray, you hope that it lasts at least a couple days. Whereas when you're dealing with the lanternflies, you can literally spray a vine one day, kill 100 bugs on it, come back the next day, and it's already full of bugs again.
Oh my God.
So, I mean, I think that's the terrifying part. The thing that we are seeing is that there definitely does seem to be a 2-year cycle. I can't say this holds true for every site, but I've seen places where they are just awful. Like, just think about your press pad just being covered with hundreds of these at any given point in time. And then the next year you get 2. So there does seem to be some level of cycle to this. It seems to be a 2-year cycle. You get them bad for 2 years and then they kind of move on. It seems like they tend to want to spread out, but there's also vineyard sites that have just been slammed by them every year in and year out. So, um, yeah, it's basically the COVID of the vineyard.
Maybe I should have mentioned before we began, for anybody out of the loop on these things, these are an invasive species that started being talked about a couple of years ago as they started to be noticed on the East Coast. And the concern is the potential for these things to do significant damage to vineyard. And people have been tracking them as they slowly spread north. And it seems like it's an ongoing process of understanding how we can deal with them and what they're actually going to do and that sort of thing. So Darrin is obviously in a place where he's had significant experience. I know that there have been spottings around us here in the Finger Lakes, but I don't know of any colleagues that have had anywhere near that level of experience with them this far north yet.
Yeah. They came in. I don't know if you heard how they came in. Someone wanted to do some landscaping and they brought in rocks. These are Chinese bugs, and they brought in rocks that for their big boulders for their landscaping project, and it had some egg sacs on it. And
oh god, that's all it takes.
They hatched, and nothing eats them. I think another positive thing for us going forward is it seems like the local fauna is slowly starting to develop a palate for them.
Okay.
So I do see more and more birds that are picking them off. Other insects that are picking them off. So that's a positive, but there's still too many of them. They breed in such high numbers, and when they hatch, there's just so many of them. They hide very well, and they hide in places where most people don't see them throughout the year, and then all of a sudden, once they hit the adult phase and they actually don't fly, they just glide. They'll start gliding and flying towards the plants that they want to eat. So the big one is the tree of heaven, and the other one is grapevines. But you'll see them on a couple of other trees as well too. I think maples and stuff like that. They like the sap from those as well. But they used to at Felino's. Our vineyard is actually at a pretty good spot as far as location from tree lines. There's a highway that runs behind the vineyard, and then there's a tree line on the other side of that highway. And the vineyard itself is mostly isolated in a field, but where I saw the lanternflies was all along the border of the property. And you could sit there and watch them try and fly over the highway. And a lot of them didn't make it, but enough of them did.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I just looked up a picture for anybody in the
They're beautiful, aren't
that
they?
we're talking about. They are pretty cool.
Yeah.
When they're just sitting there, they have like this kind of orange or red bottom wing that it looks like, if their wings aren't extended, is somewhat hidden. And they have a gray upper wing with some black spots, and they otherwise just kind of look like a moth. But if you see a gray moth with black spots on its wings,
step on it.
Kill it. Make it go crunch.
Tip. They're jumpers, and they're quite fast. Don't try and step on them from the back. Step on them from the front, because they'll jump into your foot, and then you can step on them.
Interesting.
That's a pro tip right there.
Wow. Yeah, you can tell you've crunched a couple.
Oh, I've crunched a bunch. We tried to find like fun, interesting ways to like kill them. So we were filling squirt guns with Dawn dish soap with water is enough to kill them. So I'd fill a squirt gun, give it to my nephew. But even around the winery, we were just trying to find fun ways. So we tried the salt gun. We tried those Zorby guns.
Yeah, with the hydrated those. Balls.
Yeah. Pretty much, yeah. Whatever we could. But the only thing that really deals with them is insecticides. And, until the lanternflies are out of here, we're going to have a very hard time with sustainability. Because you have to spray for them. And if you don't, the vineyard will not exist. unless you're got an army of kids out there with squirt guns with Dawn dish soap in it. They're just there's too many of them.
I wonder if like ducks would eat them or something. I feel like I saw a video on YouTube a while ago where there's like this winery in Spain that has this army of ducks, and
Yeah.
they let them into the vineyard overnight and they just peck at things.
I think they're mostly eating snails and stuff, but I haven't heard of ducks going after them. But I'd try it.
I'm just throwing it out in the universe. Maybe somebody needs to try different flocks of birds or whatever they can keep on the premises to see if they can deal with this.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm stuck. You tell me. I've got two last questions for you. One's on the current state of the wine economy and what it's like to sell wine these days, and the other one is what's the most ruined wine you've ever had to work on. You don't have to say where it was from or anything like that, but a horror story from your time. You tell me, which one would you rather talk about?
Either
or we can talk about them both.
We can do both. Clearly you want to talk about both.
Okay, well, what are your feelings? Let me back this up with a little bit of context. A lot of conversation going on from wine production people and like the professional wine space is how the wine economy, as far as trying to sell wine, is changing, and it seems like it's getting slightly harder, and people like to put it on generational change and maybe a push for low or no alcohol lifestyles and beverages, and just seems like we're in a slightly different world. As somebody who's trying to sell wine, California is in a space where they're needing to rip out a bunch of vines and things like that. So from your perspective, given that you've kind of traveled to all these different places and had more experiences, what are your feelings on where we are in the beginning of 2025 and so far as what it's like to try and sell wine in America these days?
Yeah. So right off the bat, making wine is easy. Selling wine is always hard. And I think the people with the loudest voice also have the deepest pockets, and they come from the largest regions, because the larger regions are always going to be the oversaturated regions. And I think that they're driving a lot of the narrative, in my opinion. I mean, we've certainly seen wine sales dip here, but compared to California, it seems so much less significant, and it's less of an impact to our overall business. So I think it's really the larger regions that are speaking up the most because they're feeling it a lot more. But our wines are mostly sold in Jersey. Our wines are sold to the local population, and while it's dipped slightly, it's not running us out of business. It's not ruining our overall business plan. But for these places where they rely on selling their wine because it's from these regions to places all over the country, they're seeing a lot more of an impact on it. As far as the no alcohol thing, I mean, yeah, it's kind of a new phenomenon that's cropped up, but we went through prohibition and the wine industry survived. And I think that's something that people need to keep in mind. Like, yeah, you're always going to have these trends where, the purchasing population has opinions and feelings towards what they drink and what they don't drink, but it's cyclical. It comes in waves. It changes constantly. I mean, we can all remember when the sparkling waters came out, the
like alcoholic seltzer.
Yeah, the seltzers. Sorry, yeah, the seltzers. That's the word. The seltzers. When the seltzers came out,
I'll be honest. I'm somebody who's weak for the seltzers. I love a cold seltzer.
Yeah, but you and I were around the time when they hit the market, and we remember when they hit the market. And yeah, they're still here, but now it's, the fad has changed to something else.
Yeah, they're definitely not as much of a fad.
Yeah, and I think, one thing about the wine industry is it's time, test, and prove, and it's been around for thousands and thousands of years, and it's never completely crumbled. I mean, can you imagine like our going through prohibition right now? I mean, we thought that that completely destroyed the wine industry here within the States, but it didn't. And the industry bounced back. And I think, you know, I almost, one way to kind of think about it is, you ever have a grapevine in the vineyard that you wanted to pull out and you tried to pull it out, but then you come back the next year and there's a new shoot on the ground and it just keeps growing? I kind of look at the industry as a whole like that. You know, you can cut us back, but we're going to keep growing. Grapevines are very good at growing and continuing to produce and continuing to thrive. And I think we're kind of reaching this point at the in the industry where, yeah, we are saturated. We got spoiled, and you know, the wine industry as a whole was on the upswing, growing every year, new wineries every year, and not everyone's making great wine, and it's time to maybe trim off the fat. But those of us that are producing quality products and producing products that people want to continue to drink will be just fine going through it. And um, some of the others that are just in it to make the quick buck are going to fall out, and they're going to be vocal about it. So I'm not overly concerned about the industry as a whole. Like I said, we have thousands of years of history producing wine, and the industry has survived everything along the way. And maybe it's, you know, some regions shift, and you know, certainly climate change can move which regions are the best regions and most popular regions, but um, the wine market is always going to be a desired market, and it's always going to be a sought after product. And I don't see that just dipping away because there's a new trend of non-alcoholic beverages. Um, you know, for all we know, research will come out in 10 years. It says non-alcoholic wine causes cancer.
And bring on the alcoholic wine.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I feel like an old head talking that way, but it's anything that stands the test of time is worth putting your opinion and your backing into. You know, if it was if the conversation was about seltzers, then I'd say, hey, yeah, well, you know, they've only been out for 5 years. Let's see how they do. But I think the industry will remain strong. Maybe not as strong as it was, but so many other industries are also oversaturated. I think we've just reached this like saturation point across so many industries, where, particularly here in the United States, where it seems like a money grab, and the people that are losing the most money are going to be the most vocal about it, and the people that are, you know, in it because they genuinely like the product that they're producing products from their property, producing products from their land. They they'll be vocal, but they aren't losing as much money as someone who is strictly just looking at it as an investment rather than a lifestyle.
Sure.
And I firmly believe that the industry will be okay. I'm all for people drinking no alcohol products, low alcohol wines. It's, you know, we've certainly seen trends come through, and you know, that's a personal choice, but it's not going to be around forever.
Yeah.
I really don't think so.
There are a couple of things that go through my mind hearing you talk about it. The first of which is that in the big picture, you know, wine is such a unique beverage because it's wrapped up in so much history and related to romance in a special way that nothing will take that away from the way that wine relates to people and people relate to wine. And so I think because it's special, it gives it a certain longevity, or you would like to think. The other thing that goes through my mind is I think that wrapped up similarly with this feeling of an increase in what seem like, thoughtful lifestyle choices, low and no alcohol wine, potentially being one of those, depending on what your flavor is. I would also hope that there's more interest in value driven purchasing. And I think most of the people that would probably end up on this podcast and that would be in your and my orbit are people that work at places doing things that they feel like they can stand by the value in, relatively small family owned businesses, buying local, growing local, that sort of thing, that you would hope meets people halfway, and it's what they want to buy. It's kind of good for everyone in that way if the producer and the purchaser can connect on that level.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. I mean, and I didn't really touch on it, but the whole local concept is a big driving factor. It's, these smaller regions, these smaller producers depend on the local population to purchase their products and don't depend on shipping it out to all these cities across the country that have no idea about how the wine is made or have never been to the winery. They just know that was the wine that they drank. And I think the focus on local, and I think kind of globally, I feel like we've gone away from the local thing, but now are slowly pulling back towards it. And it seems like a bit more of an emphasis. I could be totally wrong on that, but for any winery that, is selling most of their product to the local consumer, I think there's a deeper connection there and a stronger, longer lasting connection than just a label.
Totally. All right. Do you have any good wine horror stories?
Wine horror stories.
Any 250-gallon lot that was oxidized to oblivion or something like that? Or maybe the biggest mistake you've ever made? It doesn't have to be tied to a winery or anything like that. I know it can be kind of touchy.
Well, I am thinking of a wine right now that went super reductive, and it was really my first time experiencing something that went that route. And the thing that bothers me the most about it is that to this day I still don't understand why.
Interesting. For anybody outside the loop, well, will you just give me in your terms, what do you think about reduction? How would you explain it to somebody who isn't familiar with it?
Yeah, so I just want to clarify, there's like two sense of the words, reduction and reductive. They're two very different words and mean two very different things. Reductive can be more of a winemaking style. It's a style of production of wine without the presence of oxygen or keeping as much oxygen away from the wine and the juice throughout its entire production. I think most people in the industry, and myself included, will often use these almost in an interchange sense. And then you have reductive wine, which is a wine that has started to produce sulfur-driven compounds, and it's a yeast-driven thing. I guess it could also happen if you say, so like canned wines can get reductive, these sulfury compounds form in the can after. But as far as from fermentation side, it's usually driven by unhappy yeast and yeast that aren't totally satisfied with the environment that they're in, and they'll make some off smelling compounds that will be very, very present in your wines. And it only takes a small amount of these compounds to completely overpower the fruit itself.
Yeah, people describe them as being kind of cabbagey or
farty,
sweaty. Yeah.
Yeah, farty, sweaty. We have pongy. I always love that one.
Pongy?
Pongy, yeah. That's an Australian thing. It's a little pongy in here.
Interesting. So the thing that's going to drive you crazy about it is that you just don't know why.
I don't know why. For much of my career, it's not that I totally ignored it. It's more that I didn't find as much value in it, but I'd actually tested the yan on this product prior to ferment. And the yan was fine. So the most common reason for reductive reduced ferments is you just don't have enough nitrogen for the yeast, and they struggle because it's an essential nutrient for them.
And that's what yan is, yeast assimilable nitrogen. When you say you measured the yan.
Yeah. So the yan was good. And I've made so many wines without ever checking the yan, but in this case, we had checked the yan prior to ferment, and it was in the perfect range. It was in the sweet spot. I think it was right around 250 parts. I don't know if parts is the right term for that. But so the yan was good. The grapes were relatively clean. There was a small bit of gray mold on the grapes when they came in, but for the most part, I've seen uglier grapes come in and blast through ferment just fine, no problem. The yeast that I used was a non-SO2 producing yeast, which is wild. Fermentation temps were perfect the whole way through. And it went super reductive. And I have suspicions as to why, but I don't know the final cause. So yeah, that one haunts me a little bit at night.
So interesting to think about.
Yeah, I mean, from the vineyard or from the winery side, everything was on point. We checked what we needed to. The numbers, none of the numbers indicated that there was an issue arising. But it was also kind of a ferment that we did. I don't want to say forgot about, but it was tucked away, and then I would say normal fermentation time about 3 weeks. And we just came back to it one day. I had checked it numerous times throughout ferment. I don't always check everything every day. I check as much as I can, but it was a small lot, so it was kind of the bastard of the ferment, or from the vintage, if you can say. But yeah, everything seemed okay, and then one day I checked the ferment, and it just was straight reductive.
And intensely reductive.
Yes, yeah, it kind of creeped up.
If I can just mention, sometimes when wines are reductive, you can get a little waft, but it's reductive in such a way you grow to learn through smelling and understanding reduction that it can be transient, because it has to do with the way that the wine relates to oxygen. And so either over time, or if you just like move it from one tank to another or something like that, and it can receive some gentle oxygenation, you can make that issue go away pretty easily. But sometimes in certain cases the reduction can be so locked in that it can be hard or impossible to fix.
Yeah, and it felt like it almost essentially immediately went to mercaptans, which is kind of unique, because usually you get this level of reduction where you smell it and you do a splash rack, or just wait to add sulfur. But it seemed I've actually not added sulfur to that wine yet. Yeah, I have a suspicion that it's vineyard driven, but to this day I still don't entirely know what the root cause was. Like I said, the yans were good. The yeast that I was using was a non-sulfur producing SO2 H2S producing yeast. And all the fermentation temps were good. Yeah. It's will forever be a mystery for me, and you know, I guess that's just nature. But
Indeed. Nature of the
but
beast.
you're always gonna have highlights from a vintage. You're always gonna have your weaker not necessarily weaker, but your wines that you wish you did a little bit more, or did a little bit extra, or paid a little bit closer attention to, and that's just the way the cookie crumbles. I mean, there's always highlights, and there's always even in a great vintage, you're always gonna have that wine that's like, huh, well, that's the weak one.
Yeah, yeah. Paul Brock said that winemaking is a practice in compromise, and I think we all like to pretend as much as impossible that everything is perfect and nothing ever goes wrong. And if there are any customers listening, that is the case, and nothing ever goes wrong. And
Nothing ever goes wrong.
We're a higher than human, and we're perfect in every way, and so is the wine that we sell.
Exactly.
But if you're not a customer and you're in the industry, you know that. Yeah, I mean, life is what it is, and not everything's perfect.
Yep.
Oh, thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your experience.
I'll share another one with you. First year at this winery, and I was introduced to this facility, and the tanks that they had for what they quote unquote called the red room was VC tanks. They were skinny and tall, and I had started ferments on some reds that were ready for punch down. They just formed their first cap, and they were cooking. They were moving, and as I suspected, we couldn't punch them down. And so we switched to trying to pump them over. And the cap was so dense on these tall, skinny tanks that we would have the racking valve open into our pump over cart, and it would run dry. And all the wine would be sitting on top of the cap.
Well, I guess they're wet.
Yeah, they were wet, but you only got like a 10-minute pump over, and that was about it.
For anybody who can't imagine what he's describing, you ferment red wine on the skins. And so he's in a situation where he has like this kind of Red Bull can shaped tank, skinny and tall like that. And because the grapes are in there, they're forced, they float to the top of the fermentation, and they're forced into this tall, skinny cylinder, and they can form just like a block, that can be virtually waterproof. Normally you would break that up with like a machine or with like a hand tool. You would kind of mix it back up, and the danger is that the grapes can get dry, and they should be reincorporated with the liquid so that they can do some extraction. That's what the punch downs or pump overs are for. So you would pump all the wine basically from underneath the grapes to on top of the grapes, and it wouldn't go through.
That's exactly what happened. Fortunately, I had worked with the pulse air system.
Oh yeah, I remember. Just in Australia, you use that, right?
Yeah, and had I not gone to that facility and was able to work with that, I would have probably not known about it. But we were able to bring in a pulse air system into the facility, and that was those wines were the first wines that I had red wines that I had ever made that I didn't do pump overs on, and I didn't do punch downs on. I strictly 100% pulsed them.
Honestly, that sounds great, because it's I don't ever doing pump overs and punch downs, for anybody who hasn't ever done them, can be a bit of a labor of love, in that they're required often and they're physically strenuous. And so the thought of being in a world where you can avoid them sounds like a great thing to me. If I can also just mention my understanding, maybe you can clarify for me. The pulse air system, you basically put like a stiff, long, skinny tube down into the cap, and it kind of goes into the middle or maybe underneath where these grapes are, and it sends like jets, boom, 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 of air, oxygen maybe, or
yeah. Yep.
And that like agitates and breaks up this cake of grapes that's formed.
Yeah, that's
and
exactly
that worked well in that circumstance.
That worked well. Early in ferment, I love getting oxygen into wines. And then when we get down to like where the fermentation's done, but you're still retaining a cap, we switch to nitrogen. But the horror part of the story, that wasn't the horror part. The horror part of the story is what I found out is because we had pulsed them so much, it pulverized the skins into really, really small bits. And then when we loaded the press, those really, really small bits clogged the press.
Clogged it right up.
And so we would basically be sitting with a fully loaded press that was extremely difficult to generate space between the screen of the press and the cake of the skins to actually press out.
Interesting.
So we tried a bunch of different methods to make that work. Obviously, everyone who's ever been in a close situation like this is just screaming rice hulls at me right away. But also, rice hulls suck. I hate working with rice hulls. Once you use them once, you have them throughout the facility for the rest of the year.
Rice hulls.
We were able to get them pressed out eventually, and but yeah, the first couple of times. And it took me a little bit to realize that was the situation because I had never come across that before. I'd never had a. Granted, I mostly fermented red vinifera, and very few hybrids and Labrusca grapes. So I wasn't really dealing with a lot of slipskin grapes, and I know that's a lot more common in some of those grape varieties. But this was really the first time that I was like, why the heck is my Cab Franc clogging my press? It was kind of baffling. And then I realized that initial, because the pulse air is so intense when it hits the juice, and you're basically turning your ferment into soup, that it was actually pulverizing the grape skins, which I guess, part of a stylistic thing. It was, love, hate, but
I'm sure you got some good extraction.
Oh yeah. I mean, I basically equivalent that to like one of those roto fermenters where they're just like constantly mixing the whole time they're fermenting.
Yeah.
That's basically how I thought of it, because when I tell you it was soup, it was, when we finished, it was a liquid on top, and then the cap would reform, and like you would do your punch downs twice to 3 times a day, do the same thing again later.
Well, you figure that, I mean, the cap of grapes that you describe seems very substantial in its structure. And so for something to be able to put out the pressure to be able to bust that up, even if it takes over time, I'm sure it just wasn't immediately like soup, but I'm not surprised to hear that level of agitation that's required to break up that cap of grapes on top was also enough to break up the skins a significant amount. It reminds me of some experiences that we've had at Ravines over the past couple of years, where we found that our press, is quite big, and when we press machine harvested grapes, they're a little bit more sloppy, quite a bit more sloppy than like hand picked grapes, especially if they're still on the stem. And we've had a couple instances where we have enough grapes to basically fill the press all the way, basically with zero space remaining. And that inevitably causes an issue where you run the whole press cycle, which takes like an hour and a half. And then you go to check your volume, and you're supposed to have whatever, 170 gallons per ton. And then when you take your measurement, you're only at 135 gallons per ton. And you're like, how is this possible? Well, having that big sloppy like mass of grapes in the press just isn't conducive to the juice leaking out. It gets like caught in there, and the little slits in the side of the press that are supposed to allow the juice to leave, they just get clogged up by the mass of grapes that's in there. So I can relate to what you're saying. And the first time that I ran into that problem at Ravines, I was like, I don't know what to do. Turns out you have to run the press cycle again, and it's just a little bit more tedious, but you can get it the rest of the way out there. But yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, you have to add, just a side note. So rice hulls would solve that. Throwing rice hulls in when you do that.
Yeah. These rice hulls, for anybody unfamiliar, they're a press aid, and they fix this exact problem where they just help like create channels for the juice to flow out of the mash, because they're a solid structure and they're like, little lines, and so they help create little pockets where the juice can leave from.
The other thing that I used is previously pressed skins. So if it was like the second press load of the day, just throw some of those dry skins in. That helps.
Really, and that does it.
The other thing that helped, I used chips, oak chips.
Really?
So the Cab Franc that I talked about that clogged the press, I had 2 Cab Franc lots that day. One of them I fermented on chips, just loose chips in the fermenter, and the other one had none. It was just a experiment that I was running, and the one that had the chips in it, it's not really chips; they call it rice or granular. So it's smaller than oak chip, but it's about the size of a grain of rice, and I fermented on those. And so the one that had the oak granular in it didn't have a problem, but the one that did I say that backwards? The one that had the chips in it, it didn't have a problem, but the one without clogged. Right
Interesting.
Away. Yeah.
Interesting.
So,
well, the only other wrap-up question I have for you, I'll let you get back on with your life, is what will you drink for dinner tonight, whether it's tonight or on average? I mean, what have you been enjoying for dinner lately? Water or wine or Capri Sun?
Usually for dinner, it's usually water or tea.
Ooh, what kind of tea?
I like mint tea in the evening. It's like my go-to.
Little honey?
Kind of herbal teas are, I'll switch up between a couple of different herbal teas. Kind of try to avoid that caffeine late at night, but
yeah.
I don't do any sodas or Capri Suns or anything like that. It's wine, tea, or a beer. One of those 3.
I too have learned to appreciate tea most recently in life. This past year, I had COVID for the second time, and I was like, man, I just really need a little something. And my mom had left some herbal tea here in my home in Geneva. And I made one of those puppies with a little honey, and I was like, oh man, it hit like tea had never hit before. So tea can be great. Well, Darrin, thank you so much for your time. And I'm so excited because this has been the first non-New York podcast, and I've been meaning to get out of my orbit a little bit. The first Zoom podcast, and I think, as I'm looking at the time, probably also the longest podcast that I've done so far. So thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. I had a great time chatting with you, and I think we touched a lot of really important and interesting points, and I can't thank you enough.
Yeah, man. It was great talking to you, and hopefully I'll see you soon.
Hell yeah. All right, man. Thank you all so much for listening. I'm thrilled you could make it to the end of the podcast. If you have any thoughts on questions you'd like me to ask or comments about your experience, I'd love to hear them. Please don't hesitate to email me at eastcoastwinemaking@gmail.com. Until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful day.